Hey folks, welcome, welcome. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us, but welcome to the Cyber Cipher on addressing white supremacy and white nationalist violence. We have an excellent, excellent conversation for you today, so just hold tight and we're gonna wait till a few more people come in. We've got a full house here and then we'll get started. All right, let's go, y'all. Hey, everybody. I'm Alicia Garza, and welcome to the Black to the Future Action Fund's Addressing White Supremacy Cyber Cipher. I'm your host, and this cipher will be an incredible discussion with two most excellent speakers and friends of mine to help us understand the proliferation of white supremacist violence in the United States and what the Biden-Harris administration and Congress must do to address this looming and pervasive threat. We all know there's a long legacy of white supremacist violence against our communities, and this has escalated as a result of Trumpism and, of course, a whole bunch of other things, but, you know, Trump is always to blame, honey. So we must demand white supremacy be addressed as a national priority if we are to move forward as a nation. What we need for you to do right now to help us get to that point is to join us. So please do me a favor. Before I bring up our guests, please break out your phone. Go get it. Go get it from your purse. Go get it from wherever it was. I'm gonna give you 10 seconds. Break out your phone and text 510-405-4549. When you've done that, text mandate to that number. By doing this, you can join our efforts to deliver a mandate from Black America. And thank you so much to the Black to the Future Action Fund for convening us. I think you're ready, so let's get started. First and foremost, I want us to start off with some context, and joining us to do that is my friend, Scot Nakagawa. He is the senior partner at the Change Lab, a community organizer, activist, cultural worker, and political writer. He has spent the last 4 decades exploring questions of racial justice and injustice, racial formation, and effective forms of resistance and strategies for change through community campaigns. He's done cultural organizing, popular education, writing, and direct political advocacy. Basically, what I'm trying to tell you is Scot has done it all, okay? Scot's primary work has been in the fight against vigilante violence, vigilante white supremacist groups, white nationalism, nativism, and authoritarian evangelical political movements. In this work, Scot has served as a strategist, an organizer, and a social movement analyst. He's a past Alston Bannerman Fellow and the Association of American Studies 2017 Community Leader. He's busy at work on a number of projects, I know this very well, including writing a playbook for anti-fascists and a primer on race and power. We love to see it. His writings have been included in Race, Gender, and Class in the United States in Integrated Study, the 9th edition, Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence, and Eyes Right, Challenging the Right-Wing Backlash. Scot, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's so good to be here with you. I got to ask you, let's start off with a context conversation. How have Asian communities. And we know Asian communities are a diaspora. And if you don't know that when you're watching, this is the first thing I'm gonna tell you, okay? Just like all Black people ain't from the same place, all Asian people ain't from the same place either, child. So we are a diaspora. So talk with us about how the diaspora has been impacted by recent white supremacist violence and terror. And what's the legacy of this type of violence on our communities and on our movements?
Okay, well, that's a complicated question, as you know. And so I'm going to take us a step back to understand a little bit more about the bigger context in which that context needs to be understood, right? So, we are in the process now of, globally, of a really rapid slide toward autocracy. There's something called the VDEM Institute. It's a democracy watchdog organization based in Gothenburg, Sweden, that tracks democracies around the world. And what they're reporting is that for the first time in this century, the majority of the world's nations are autocracies. So they have autocratic governments. The majority of people live under them. At this point, it's about 68% of the world's population, and about a third of nations are headed in that direction. And the United States is one of them, right? These include G20 nations, nations like Brazil, for example, Turkey. India has now become the world's largest electoral autocracy. And more and more movements are rising in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, and really around the world. So this is the context in which white supremacy is gaining a greater and greater foothold in the United States, radical white supremacy, I should say. And what the driver is in most of the world is ethnic nationalism, just as it is here in the United States. White nationalism is the driver. It's the point of the spear of autocratization here in the US. And when I say autocratization, what I mean is, losing our democratic traits, freedom of the press, for example, trust in elections, things that have, over the course of the Trump administration, become exaggerated, but that have been happening here for a long time. And what is a backlash that really most of us who are studying this see as being rooted in the immediate reaction to the civil rights movements and the gains that were made in that period. So we're seeing the decades-long articulation of that rejection. Essentially, what we see is a growing number of conservative white Americans who are basically saying, if these civil rights reforms are the open door to integration and equal participation in society, particularly of African Americans, but also of the growing numbers of immigrants in this country, immigrants of color, we want that door shut. And we see that happening again and again. If welfare is going to be equitably administered, we don't want it. If unions become the route through which workers of color can gain a foothold in our economy, we don't want them. So over and over and over again, we've seen this, and that escalation toward autocracy has gotten really fast under the Trump administration. So that's kind of where we're at now. So Asian Americans are being targeted in that context. The situation for us now is that there's a rising number of hate crimes. Stop AAPI Hate, which is a national organization dedicated to documenting and building opposition to anti-Asian violence, has recorded about 3,800 incidents of harassment, exclusion, including denial of services and violence between around March 2020 and February of this year. Of these reports, women are 2.3 times more likely to report than men. An indication that in a lot of these cases, the reason why Asian Americans are being targeted is because in a climate in which racism of this kind has been given permission, we're considered especially vulnerable because of stereotypes that pertain to us. And that makes Asian women even more vulnerable. So the attacks against Asian women have been happening at a much higher rate. And all of that, occurs in this context, right? Chinese are the most frequently targeted, Koreans follow, Filipinos follow them, but Asian Americans in general are being targeted. And, it's easy to just say it's a problem of white supremacy, which it is, but our attackers aren't all white people. So in these incidents, there are a number of situations which people of color have been the perpetrators, right? Now, that's been discussed a lot in the media and I think somewhat exaggerated. It's easy to exaggerate those numbers because, of course, for example, Black people are more often arrested for every kind of crime practically, right? And because a lot of these are anecdotal and they get blown up because they follow media narratives that are popular. One of which is that there is rising tension or a continuing tension between Black and Asian communities, which is true in some instances and not in others. But there's all kinds of tension at this point. So, you know, that's basically what's happening. But the context in which that is happening is one that is given permission to this kind of racism. And then in that context as well, there is rising xenophobia, particularly in the targeting of China as a particularly bad global actor on the part of US political leaders, Trump first and now Biden, right? So our current President Biden has continued the attack on China and is basically using what I think of as anti-China populism as a way of trying to bridge divides within the United States and cobble together what amounts to a kind of hawkish political and economic foreign policy agenda. So that's, you know, at least part of what's happening here. I think you might be frozen, Alicia, so I'm going to keep talking. But you know, one of the things that I think that is happening as well is that when the ethnic majority in a multiracial democracy goes in a nationalist direction, it's an indication that people in general are letting go of the kind of overarching and unifying themes of nationalism. In the case of the United States, because we find them to be deeply oppressive. In many, many ways. People of color have found them to be so, and increasingly white people in a society that is turning to a broad majority are finding it unsatisfying as well. And so, you know, that's part of the kind of process that we're in. When that happens, minority groups tend to react to the threats like racial cleansing that start to rise in that context by going in a much more particularistic direction. So they tend to let go of solidarity and try to batten down the hatches in order to protect themselves and find themselves more and more and more corralled into smaller and smaller ideas about who we are. And so when a big question like, can we move forward together in order to embrace what might be a dangerous and difficult future, people are more likely to answer no, that the better way to go is to separate. And so that contributes to this kind of moving away of the racial majority from the idea of multiracial democracy and greases the skids toward autocracy. And little bits of evidence of that are indicated, I think, in what we see happening to Asian Americans at this point, because Asian Americans are easily named as foreigners, right? As not really loyal to the United States government.
Thank you for that. Sorry I dropped off for a hot second, but I'm back in full effect. You know what I mean? We're unfazed by this. So I got to ask you, because we're talking about xenophobia, we're talking about how white supremacy isn't only enacted by white people, right? All of us, right, can help further an agenda of white supremacy, or we can further an anti-racist agenda. So I got to ask you, I mean, what role has white supremacy played in pitting our communities against each other, particularly the Asian diaspora and the Black diaspora? Can you talk a little bit about the history of that and where we find ourselves now? And then where can you point to that our struggles are actually deeply connected, even though our experiences may be very different?
Well, you know, Asian Americans and African Americans in particular have been pitted together against one another throughout US history, especially in the period, of course, immediately following the Civil War, when the first Chinese immigrant laborers were imported to the United States. You know, Asian immigrant workers have often been brought in as replacement workers or as workers to interrupt organizing on the part of Black labor. And in that way, we've been really purposefully pitted against one another. But there's also just been this sort of zero-sum game that has been promoted about what it means to be an American, that if some people become viewed as full citizens, that other people must therefore be excluded. And so in that process, Asian Americans and African Americans have often been compared. More recently, I think one of the drivers of tension is the model minority myth, the Asian American model minority myth, which is a relatively recent creation, you know, that was actually made by people. It's a social construct, which means people made it and they didn't have to, but they did. And that social construct of the model minority myth was created in order for Asian Americans to try to leverage themselves into full inclusion in the period right around World War II, when Japanese Americans were subjected to mass internment and Chinese Americans were subjected to anti-communist campaigns of deportation and exclusion. And so that myth, which basically says that Asians are more hardworking, more educationally oriented, are more value more to have intact families, and are basically better workers, has really been used to try to promote the notion that Asian Americans should be included on the part of certain historic Asian American organizations. So we have to own that, right? But then in the period around the Civil Rights Movement, that idea was co-opted, adopted, and adapted by white conservatives in order to make the argument, if Asian Americans can go from poverty to inclusion, from being in mass internment camps to finding their way into the into being assimilated into the white middle class, then why can't everyone? And make the argument that the reason we are able to do it is because what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and we know that we're willing to struggle stoically, that we're basically willing to be the perfectly exploitable worker, one that goes to work, and no matter how much we suffer, we never complain, and somehow naturally then therefore get rewarded, right? So this notion was used in order to attack welfare and affirmative action and other key gains of that period, and that has had the result of driving up tensions. What the downside of that is for Asian Americans is, of course, whether you're considered subhuman, as we were in the period when we were first coming to the United States and viewed as a yellow peril who was more loyal to our foreign countries of origin to the United States, or superhuman as in the model minority myth. None of those things cast us as just human beings. And so we're always held out as the other. And in this moment of anti-Asian violence rising, we see the effect of that.
That was really powerful, Scott. Thank you so much. I want to move to my friend and Black Futures Lab Advisory Board member, Melissa Harris Perry. Melissa, I'm so happy that you're here. Melissa is the Maya Angelou Presidential Chair at Wake Forest University, the founder and president of the Anna Julia Cooper Center, and co-creator and co-host of the excellent podcast. And I do mean it's excellent. I don't even really like podcasts like that, except for my own. But it's really excellent. So the name of the podcast is System Check, and she's a co-host with Dorian Warren, who is also amazing. From 2012 to 2016, she hosted the award-winning weekend show, Melissa Harris Perry, on MSNBC. There's so much I could say about her, but she actually erased some of her bio, so I couldn't tell you all her damn accomplishments, because that's how Melissa rolls. But Melissa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, that was crazy. I looked in that document. I was like, we're not going to name the kids and all the chickens and dogs. That's crazy. We're going to move on.
Next time we go into shoot. Okay, so let me ask you, we just came out of the strangest 4 years in my lifetime for sure. And there's a lot of strange things that happened in my life. Let me ask you, how has the rise of Trumpism and the embrace of white nationalists and white nationalism by high-level elected officials impacted and changed the political landscape?
So, I'm always the contrarian. So I've been trying to think a little bit about, like, genuinely, what do I think about this question? Because I think that, at the beginning of the 4 years ago, so 2016-ish, 5 years ago now, my sense was Donald Trump is he's the dependent variable, right? So again, I'm sorry, do a little nerdy here, right? But all the independent variables are the things that move and make something happen. And then there's the dependent variable. We're seeing how that rises and falls. And so my sense was, well, Trump isn't anything new, right? Trump is just the expression of all of these other sort of moments, experiences, histories, trajectories, choices, right, of America. most specifically of white Americans, but really American choices broadly, because Black American choices, I'll give you an example when I say a Black American choice here. For example, the Congressional Black Caucus being such strong supporters of the criminalization laws, right, in the 1990s, right? So that's what I mean by Black choices. I don't necessarily mean individual Black people. Okay. But then I watched the last 4 years and surprisingly enough became more of a believer in the sort of inherent power of the American presidency. You would think as a political scientist that I would already believe that the presidency was powerful, but I didn't particularly until watching the ways that that particular platform worked for Donald Trump. But I still want to start us now by saying, I want us to be really careful about censuring Donald Trump really in anything, except maybe a criminal trial. But other than that, I don't particularly want to censor him. So here's a suggestion I'd like to make, not just for tonight, but sort of going forward as we talk both about white supremacy and about violence, because I think we have a tendency to limit both and make both far too narrow in their conception. So I think when we hear the phrase white supremacist violence, especially if you're hearing it kind of in general, broad media terms or academic terms, and not necessarily in activist communities, then what folks are talking about is particular individuals and their belief systems. If they're talking about legal frameworks, they're often talking about actually vocal utterances, right? So part of the hate crime legislation is not just that you have to believe it and feel it, you have to scream it out, right? So as you kill the Black person, as you attack the queer person, you have to say, right, particular kinds of slurs. And we think that violence is corporal, is physical. And I do not want to downplay that, the critical nature of that kind of violence, especially today, when we watched the literal toggling back and forth, right? In a single Midwestern city, right? The toggling back and forth between violence enacted on the actual bodies of Black men. So I want to be careful not to discount that, but I also don't want us to think that that's all that white supremacy is and that that's all that white supremacist violence is. So I have a few suggestions because I think, let me be clear, because I think when that happens, then only some people think they're responsible for addressing it. So here's how I've been thinking about it, right? So white supremacy is not a glitch in the machine. It's not like an accidental thing that happened that if we just fix it, then everything else will be all right. It's not a personal failing and it's not new, right? So anytime you hear somebody say, oh, like America's great except for the white supremacy, or, it's not a glitch in the machine. It's not an accident. And it is not new, which means not only that it's not new to Donald Trump, it's not new to the 21st century, it's not new to the 20th century, right? All right, so here are some things that it is, right? White supremacy is a system of disinformation. So at all levels, white supremacy tells lies. It tells lies about what is beautiful. It tells lies about who is smart. It tells lies about what it's important to know. It tells lies about who cooks good food. It tells lies about who is smart. It is a pervasive system of disinformation. It is fake news at the highest possible level, and we buy it and consume it in ways that we're not even always aware of. It is like way more evil than TikTok. Okay. White supremacy is an algorithm. So quite literally, it's an algorithm in that, like, apparently, facial recognition can't tell the differences between Asian faces. It can't tell the difference between Black folk faces. Let there be low light, the algorithm goes crazy. It's an algorithm because Facebook will push off anything you say about Black Lives Matter, but you can scream out about white supremacy all day. So white supremacy is an algorithm. White supremacy is a sin, which means that part of the responsibility of addressing white supremacy rests within faith communities. White supremacy is a public health crisis. White supremacy is psychological warfare. White supremacy is domestic terrorism. White supremacy is a rigged political system. White supremacy is model misspecification. What do I mean by that? Anybody who's an academic, who's a scholar, who thinks the reason you need to hire faculty of color is so that you can have some mentorship doesn't understand that no, the reason is because all your models are misspecified. You don't even understand how the cosmos works when you are presuming a bunch of white supremacist beliefs at the start of it. White supremacy is, in a certain way, a private chat function. So we talk about dog whistles. I would like us to stop using that language because it's really racist towards dogs. But it is a private chat function. It's like we're all in here together having a conversation, but like some folks are over there on the private chat function doing something separate. It is durable, it is pernicious, and this is part of also what's critical. It is connected to a bunch of other systems of hatred and violence, including patriarchy and sexism, colonialism, homophobia, transphobia. So part of the reason, right, that Asian women are targeted has in part to do with, for example, Muslim women who wear hijab, who get targeted because they are visibly, right, sort of identifiable as one kind of person, and therefore somehow as a threat. It's because of our beliefs about how East Asian women, right, who they are and what they represent. So a big part of how I want us to think about all of this is about the big systems and the ways that it is infected in all pieces. And yet also to know that the particular kinds of violence that we typically mean, corporal violence, violence against our bodies, has in fact increased. And those self-identified white supremacists have increased since the 2016 to 2020 Trump presidency. So both of those things can be true at the same time. All these long, durable systems and visible, identifiable, empirical increases in that particular kind of violence over the course of the past 5 years.
You understand me? Hold on. Hold on. I mean, I just need to take a breath. Everybody take a breath, because you just got schooled. You just got for free, my friends. You're welcome, for free. You just got some of this. Woo! I love the way your brain works. Thank you. Let's talk about this. Look, you're right that white supremacist corporal violence has indeed grown by 55% during the last presidency. And the FBI declared white nationalism a top national security threat. In fact, more so than quote unquote Black Lives Matter or Antifa, okay? And so even though that's true, right? There's been little accountability. I mean, we literally had white supremacists storm the US Capitol, attempt to kidnap sitting elected officials. And then this part I can't stop talking about. I don't know, maybe it's the pop culture in me, but like there was feces smeared inside of the building, and like people arrested. They like, okay, so this is my actual.
I want to say one thing on that,
Yes.
because it took me a minute as I was watching it. In my lived experience, and I think as something that we can make a claim to historically, one of the ways that white people, not all white people, but particularly white folks who are in positions of power or seek to be in positions of power, one of the ways that white culture, let's think of that example, white cultural expressions within the US, one of the ways they have represented that they own something, that something belongs to them, is by tearing it up. So I just want you, like, so if you were raised by Black folk, or even ever just went to visit your Black cousin in the summertime, whatever, but if you got Black people, then you know there were some rules about how you demonstrated ownership of something, right? So if you had a Black parent, then in the summertime you did not run in and out of the house. Why? Because the floor was clean, and so it had to stay clean. So you could go out and you stay your ass out until you come in later, because there's labor and work to be done, because how you show ownership is through a certain pride of presentation, right? Poor little Black children get up like 2 a.m. to get our hair brushed and parted and laid back in order to go to church, because this is my child, and part of how I will show you that this is my child is that she will be together, snatched, right, all of that. One of the ways that white supremacy has demonstrated that it owns something is by destroying it. How do I know that's my slave? Because I can beat it. How do I know that's my wife? Because I can have sex with it anytime I want. How do I know that my basketball team just won? Because I just burned down the whole damn campus as a demonstration of my excitement about our national championship. So part of the defecation, part of the literally shitting all over it, is that you're saying, this mine, it's so mine that I can shit all over it. And by the way, Black folks will come in to have to clean it up later. When I saw that man's feet on Nancy Pelosi's desk,
You understand me?
that, to me, that was a rape in effigy, right? Just like you could hang someone in effigy, you can rape someone in effigy. It is a way of showing, like, you are so mine, I so run this that I can just smear it up, I can destroy it. And I think it is hard to watch for folks who culturally are positioned to understand that ownership means preciousness, it means care, it means preserving it, right, over time. But destruction has been part of how white supremacist culture has represented ownership.
Ooh, you know, and then went and showed the shit off. That's the, I mean, went cameras and was like, oh, I left a quarter on her desk though. Okay, anyways. So this is my actual question. You know, Melissa, oh, we're gonna have a recording. Don't you worry, the record button is on. Yes, yes, indeed, Anita. Okay, so in what ways is the government, because I think that we have this notion, right, that government is supposed to protect us. That is technically, right, supposed to be the definition of why you have a government, right? It's supposed to be like the clearinghouse to ensure that everything gets treated equally. Of course, we know that's not how the thing was built, and it was built for, you know, white propertied men, cisgender, heterosexual, propertied meaning you owned Black people and land. It was created to make sure that there was equitable distribution between those folks, right? So we get that, but we have still taken, right, over time, this notion that government is supposed to be the arbiter. Melissa, we have the FBI, right, saying that white nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy in this country today. And yet they're not really doing that much to uphold that. So in what ways is the government complicit in acts of white supremacist violence and terror across all of those areas that you spoke of earlier?
Right, so this is the other sticky part of the problem about white supremacy, is that in addition to all those other kind of negative things that I suggested, it's also an extremely powerful and profitable reward system. And so I know it's very popular to say, oh, racism hurts white people. Okay, I mean, sure, all right. But overall, it's really helpful. It's actually, when people are like, oh, why did white women vote against their interests? They did not. They voted for whiteness. And whiteness, like, if you have to cast your lot with whiteness or womanhood, oh, cast your lot with whiteness all day, baby. That is much more likely, right, to pay off. It's actually extremely valuable. It is, there's nothing like the wealth gap, right? That racial wealth gap, where right now, Black communities are on a road to zero. By 2053, median wealth in Black communities is supposed to be zero if we don't address it. And that started happening before COVID-19, okay? Right now in this country, 400 individuals, not 400 companies, not 400 corporations, 400 people have as much wealth as the entire Black community and 1/4 of Latinos. 400 people like could fit in a good house party, as much wealth as all Black people and 1/4 of Latinos put together. So yeah, it's important to recognize people don't typically work against their interests unless we shift the incentive structures of what their interests are. Some of the most important places where government reproduces white supremacy are in federalism, right? So an entire system where not only federalism, but also devolution. So again, racism is a public health crisis. We saw this problem with federalism and devolution in the context of COVID-19. Let's not have a national plan during a global pandemic. Let's definitely not do that. Let's let each state work it out as though, right, a contagious disease can't cross state lines. And then not only every state, let's have a fight between governors who are white, full stop. Right? Governors are white people, and right, mayors. And in large cities, mayors are much more likely to be people of color. So let's have that fight so that over and over again, governors, white folks, are making decisions based on economic, narrow notions of economic transactional interests, right? While mayors, much more likely to be people of color, and particularly Black folks, are making decisions based on much longer term economic interests, right? And the public interest and the public health of brown and Black communities. So what I would say is, you want to really think about where white supremacy lives in our government. It lives in the filibuster, which means that white folks are overrepresented and are able to control every single item of the agenda. White supremacy lives in federalism and in devolution to localities, so that local tax bases aren't there to protect and support, and where these decisions are being made between white state-run folks and brown people of color. And white supremacy lives in the entire system of security and policing. And the very fact that the language of it is security suggests the kind of disinformation of white supremacy that tells us that somehow these people who kill us are keeping us safe, whereas they think of us as terrifying, even though the likelihood of a Black person killing a police officer, empirically very low. The likelihood of a police officer killing a civilian of any kind, but particularly an African-American one, right, order of magnitude higher. But the question is, was the officer who was standing there armed, were they afraid?
Woo! It's fire. It's fire. It's fire. Okay. We don't have that much time for me to do all my hype lady moves, but I want to bring Scott back into this conversation too. Look, our sister organization, the Black Futures Lab, conducted a national Black survey to understand the opinions on issues impacting Black communities. And over half of our respondents said that they feel very to somewhat unsafe in this country. And what they want most from the Biden-Harris administration is to declare white supremacy and declare white supremacy a national security threat. This is complicated, but this is what folks said. Yeah. So Black to the Future, we have a policy roadmap that we are calling the Build Back Bolder plan, and it's the Black mandate for the Biden-Harris administration. And it includes policy solutions like requiring ongoing and specific data collection, requiring regular and transparent reporting on the government's efforts to curb white nationalist violence, requiring regular, accurate, and transparent reporting on government efforts to disrupt the systems and networks that foster white nationalist terrorism, strengthening the Office of Civil Rights, which was literally gutted in this last 4 years and deeply under-resourced prior to that, but strengthening that office, right, inside of the Department of Justice by requiring greater transparency. And then also enacting stricter guidelines around surveillance funding and ensuring that budgets that are approved to protect civil rights cannot be allocated in ways that ultimately thwart them. Now, I want to say something quick before I ask this question, because I was, today years old. Actually, I just learned this a month or two ago, that actually the Department of Justice, right, was created under Reconstruction. And right, that the purpose of it, like the creation of an attorney or a solicitor general position, was all about, right, fighting the Klan. And it was about fighting the Klan because the Klan was messing up the economic reconstruction of this country. And these people were like, let me tell you something, okay? I don't care if you like Black people or not, but what you're not gonna do, what you're not gonna do is be out here wilding and burning up people's communities, because you know what, you're costing us money. And we had a lot of money lost during the Civil War, and we are not playing with you. So I believe it was Ulysses S. Grant, yeah? So he was like, check this out. We gonna take these Klan people out, okay? So we should know that the Department of Justice, right, has its roots, right, in this exact mandate, right, which was to curb this violence. Now, certainly it was for a different kind of purpose than what we're talking about, but at the same time, you get in where you fit in. So Scott, let me ask you first, and then I want to head to Melissa. What are you seeing other movement leaders focused on when it comes to combating white nationalism, combating white supremacy? And what do you think our communities should be doing? Is there a gap between what we're focused on and what we should be doing? And this isn't to like talk no mess, because honestly, I just want to tell you, and I want to say this boldly and proudly, we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what we're doing. And if we knew what we were doing, honey, we'd be headed to a hot girl summer, but we don't. And so therefore, this is why my summer is going to be messed up. But anyways, that includes all of us, including me. I'm like trying to figure it out. We're trying to figure it out together. That's the whole point of this space. So let's talk. Scott, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to figure it out too, right? I actually have started something with a couple of other people called the 22nd Century Initiative, where we want to do a kind of big scoping project to try to figure out how are we addressing the kind of paramilitary and violent part of the expression of white supremacy? How are we actually addressing the fact that, you know, seeing themselves maybe starting to lose the game, you know, these white nationalists have decided to just throw the board out the window with all of the playing pieces. We're not prepared for addressing that kind of problem, except as a law enforcement problem. But addressing it as primarily as a law enforcement problem is a big, big problem in and of itself, right? So, you know, what you said about the Justice Department is kind of followed in subsequent decades throughout history along that same pattern. You know, when white supremacy, when white nationalist violence becomes a law enforcement problem, it's long, long after the fact that the movements are building, the problem is growing, that the challenge is becoming more and more difficult to surmount, right? Because the kind of foundational ideas, the things that Melissa was talking about, and that context that she described as systemic white supremacy is meanwhile unaddressed, right? So it's almost like it heals the system when law enforcement responds. You know, a friend of mine recently told me this thing that, you know, just kind of shook me up a little bit. He said that the narrative, the root narrative of American society is white supremacy, right? It's how nationality, the primary identity under which the nation state of the United States was founded, you know, that is stronger than the law. And what he meant by that is that the way that white supremacy is articulated in the culture, the way it is reproduced ideologically, is stronger than the law. And so when, you know, some assholes decide they're going to, you know, like raid the Capitol, or when white nationalists blow up a federal building in Oklahoma City, or when a police officer decides to put his knee on the neck of an already subdued person without any arms for 9 minutes and kills him, you know, that those moments, there's all this outrage and the law is mobilized, but the law is mobilized in a way that protects that ongoing narrative of white supremacy by dealing with those incidents as if they're outlier incidents and not actually very integral to that process of reproducing all of those things that Melissa pointed out earlier so incredibly well. And so, you know, we need to start to see these things as connected, right? That these acts of terror are not disconnected to the ongoing perpetuation of structural racism, which is how I see white supremacy articulated now in contemporary culture past the civil rights movement and the taking down of explicit racial codes, right? So, you know, if we can do that, I think that we have a little bit of a fighting chance here. But that's a really big shift that people are going to have to go through. You know, for one thing, when we say we need to address the narrative of white supremacy, people immediately go to, you know, like white power, right? And that is an important kind of stance to make, but we need to understand that the way it's being articulated and perpetuated is way more complicated than that. It is embedded in like key narratives of society. The idea that retribution equals justice, for example, is a way in which white supremacy is perpetuated, right? The idea that liberty and justice are incompatible is another way, right? The white right has drawn a color line right through American ideology with justice on one side and liberty on the other, such that when justice is advanced, they say liberty is threatened, right? And they're forcing white folks to make a choice. We cannot make those choices in that way because justice must be won with liberty, and liberty means nothing if there's no justice. The other thing is this idea that what kills you makes you stronger, right? That in other words, when the going gets rough, the tough get going, that's just BS. In fact, the kind of trauma that people experience, the hardships that they endure don't make them stronger. They cause trauma, they cause stress, and that actually makes communities more fragile. So that notion needs to be thrown out the window. And then finally, there's this idea about makers and takers in society, that there's one group that are the makers and another group that's the takers that have historically been cast as people of color and especially African Americans, right? That we need to shake up. There are no makers and takers. There are makers and takers in every single community. We are all giving and taking all of the time, and that society as a whole cannot function without us. Until we can get to that idea, we're going to continue to shred the social safety net, thinking it's for them, not for me. We're going to continue to step away from the notion that it's possible in a very difficult time for us to move forward together, right? We need to seek out those solutions together if we're to greet this difficult future. So, you know, I feel like that's where we're kind of stuck, you know, and that people are really struggling to try to figure out how do we move beyond these kind of binaries of good and evil and start to recognize that in the march toward authoritarianism, for example, all of us have a role to play. We may not all be as active as agents, but we are all reacting to these conditions in ways that open the door wider and wider to authoritarian ideas as we give up on the notion that we actually do have the capacity to move forward together. Only 3% of the public supports overt white nationalism, right? A third of the public supports the idea that we should be preserving our white European heritage. That's a soft entry point, right? In order to be able to address that idea, we need to reframe the entire debate. And we need to recognize that 3% is a tiny minority. We're the majority. We have to figure out how to go from being the majority to acting like it.
You better work, Scott. Yes, you better work. Come on with this makers and takers. Hello, people. We are an interdependent society, and we can decide, is that going to be a parasitic dependence? Right? Or is it going to be cooperative? And we saw all of this over this last year. It was like the blankets got pulled back. We were like, oh yeah, no, really. Like I need you and you need me. Okay. Anyways, Melissa, what do you think about this?
Man, I mean, just like so many good frameworks there. So like, I want to just go in on the freedom thing for 1 second, because I do think it's so critical and so kind of maddening, particularly when we think about the context of enslaved Black folk in the US South and the descendants of enslaved Black folk in the US South, who know that there is no distinction between freedom and justice. That in fact, that's the actual crux of, for me, why I keep thinking that, like, for me, Black folks are the Americans. It's always very odd to me, this notion that we are somehow not American, when it feels like, well, actually, we're the only ones who seem to believe that crazy ass document, right? So if you think about what the Declaration of Independence says, right, not what is real in the moment of 1776, right? As Thomas Jefferson sits on the Monticello Mountain overlooking his own enslaved children, right? Not that. But the fact that even as he does that, right, he writes a document that says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these, not all of them, but among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then, like, it's like we always stop there, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among persons deriving their just powers from consent of the governed. Like, there it is. The whole reason government exists is to create the maker taker, right? That we contribute to government so that we may draw from it, that we give in and pull out. Well, now that just turned weird. Okay, so, but that is the core aspect of what this particular project in self-governance, this extraordinary project, right? See, I turned into such an American here, right? But this extraordinary experiment in self-governance, which is unique, right, in the world when it occurs in 1776, and is only ever made even vaguely close to the realization of those ideals by the most marginalized, by women who are shut out of it, by Black folks who are enslaved in it, by people who are told that they cannot come from this border, right, not from the Pacific, and no, not from the southern border. So I do think that ideas matter, and that very notion that white supremacy is individual bias is so dangerous that we have to not talk about white supremacy. That might be racism, that might be bias, those are fine words to use for it, but white supremacy is this deeply pervasive system. Let me say one more thing about where deeply pervasive systems get a lot of reproduction. And that really is through our media and popular culture. Now, I'm not media police. I always want more, not less. I'm all down with all the problematic stuff as long as there's lots coming in as well. But part of what happened in the 1990s with the deregulation of how your news is brought to you and the profit aspects of that is that we have white supremacy was always embedded in American media, but it got embedded with a profit motivation that is bizarrely evil. Like the power of it is stunning to watch. And so I would just ask everyone to really be very conscious that particularly if you're getting your news from cable news and you think, oh, at least I'm not getting it from Facebook or something. But if you, sorry, Facebook, but if you're getting it from cable news, that means you're getting it from like Universal, you're getting it from Disney, like you're literally getting it from the same people who have theme parks in Orlando. Please think about what that means, right? It may seem to you that you're getting your ideological worldview and therefore that is accurate, but I'm just asking you, whatever you're getting, question it, wonder about it, think about it, push back on it a little bit. And maybe, get your news via audio rather than watching it because it is a more unregulated, less profit driven, as Alicia knows, the podcast, so ain't nobody in podcast making money. So it's not about profits there, right? And so you're going to get a different kind of news in that space. Last thing I want to say is about that whole, that when we call the police in a moment like this, that we redeem them, please go back and remember the movie Crash, right? This Crash was like what, like 1990, whatever. Alicia, you were probably 8 or something, but you'll remember the movie Crash won like the Academy Award, but that was a police redemption movie, right? This guy sexually assaults Thandie Newton in a racist police stop, but what the movie ultimately does is have a car accident where the racist, sexist, rapist cop is able to pull Thandie Newton out of the burning car and therefore remind us that even if they rape us, even if they shoot us, even if they're racist, we still are going to need police when it goes down. And so I just really encourage us again, like, if we believe that we can solve problems without police, just try it. Try it. Try not calling 911. Try some alternate ways of addressing those problems so that we don't do that redemptive story.
I don't even want to stop this conversation, but I want to bring the audience in, and there are a ton of questions up in here, honey. So let me start with this one. Scott, can you explain what you mean about Biden extending the anti-China racist attacks? They wanted to just get a little more clarification on that.
Yes, well, the Biden administration has a specific anti-China agenda, right? And, we are still in the context of, viewing the situation of the US and China as a competitive one. One of the things that, often surprises people when we talk about China, because we hear about the air quality in China being so incredibly bad, is that the Chinese government is actually doing much more to try to combat climate change than the United States. But that's not the narrative we hear, right? We hear this other narrative that justifies a kind of anti-China posture that helps to clarify a lot of people's fears in the context of a world in which the US status is falling, right? And we somehow feel entitled to that, as if somehow that's our God-given right that we should be on top. And those of us who never have been are like, okay, what, But the reality is that, all of that ends up getting articulated when it's justified domestically as anti-China populism, basically a kind of xenophobic populism. And that expression of that on the street on a daily basis is those numbers I told you at the beginning of Asian Americans being harassed or violently attacked. There is this need for a scapegoat at a time when it's so difficult to explain all of the different changes happening to us in the world. And, people are reaching for those explanations, and political leadership in that context makes all of the difference. How people talk about things, who they talk about, makes a huge difference in that context. Because, people are going to go looking, right, for explanations. And the key explanations they've been given through the last many years is basically that they're either foreign invaders or domestic, sort of takers who are ruining the situation for us. They're immigrants, they're foreign nations, they're Black people on welfare. They're, these kinds of, sort of enemies of the state that have been positioned all around us that are, basically, like not even beginning to be the problem, right? So use the word parasite earlier. The parasites that we've been living with are, elite white oligarchs. They're the ones who are, receiving the most of what we, could call welfare in society. And they are also extracting from us our labor value, and are the ones who are, raping our environment, basically. So, the benefits of those things, we talk about them as this kind of American dream, but they're not by any means evenly distributed. So, I think that that's the stuff that we need to be looking at. But, I got kind of far afield from China, but, the Biden administration is justifying a kind of hawkish foreign policy sort of agenda with, in part, this anti-China rhetoric that's translated domestically as a kind of form of racist populism.
Okay, Melissa, I'm gonna let you close this out. And this question I love, and I particularly love the way that you answer it. So this is going to you. This one is from Felix, and Felix asks, do you believe that voting for the Democratic Party changes nothing about the immediate needs of the Black community? Or that by not voting at all, that you allow the Republican Party to continue to erase civil rights policies? What's your take on this, Melissa?
So yeah, no, it's not that it changes nothing. We should vote, and there are lots of reasons why we should vote. But voting is the brushing your teeth of democracy. So like I tell my students, I want you to vote because I always want to live in a world where people have good oral health. So you vote because it is critical to the health of democracy, because it is critical to your health, because it is a first step. But I'm also not giving you an award for brushing your teeth. Now, let's be clear. When I'm saying that to my students tend to be people of privilege for whom there are not great barriers to voting. Sometimes I will give you an award for brushing your teeth because literally every time you try to get some toothpaste and a toothbrush, everyone is snatching it back from you. So that's slightly different. But it is still, it's a very blunt instrument. It is a critical but blunt instrument. So it is the first step or the last step, or just one step, step number 7, whatever, in your engagement process. Now, do I think there's a meaningful difference between Democrats and Republicans? Usually on some important policies, but do I know for damn sure there are lots of rapists in the Democratic Party and that they nonetheless voted for Hillary? Of course they did. And do I know that there are plenty of white supremacists in the Democratic Party who voted for President Obama? So what we also can't do is judge anyone's one vote as an indication of their entire ideological or ethical or intellectual capacity and worldview. So let me say one more thing. I said the thing before about try not calling the police. And somebody in the chat said, hey, doesn't that mean you have to build community first? So I'll say yes, and that goes back to the misinformation that is white supremacy. I know at the start of this pandemic that one of the shows that was trending everywhere was the show Preppers, right? Disaster Preppers. So we ask ourselves, how do we prepare for a disaster? And what we think a disaster is the pandemic, or a disaster is a hurricane, or a disaster is whatever. You watch Preppers and it's going to tell you one thing about what happens when this natural disaster hits. All your neighbors are going to run out into the street, ripping and tearing like zombies, trying to get in. So what you need is big, strong walls and plenty of food and medicine downstairs for you and your family. Disaster Preppers is all about individualism and borders. Let me just suggest that that's not what the disaster is. All generations are going to have pandemics. We're going to have floods. We're going to have forest fires. And our generation gets to have even more because of the way we've treated the earth. That's still not the disaster. The disaster already exists. Those are just the crises that show us what the disasters are. The disasters are the inequalities. And the only way to prep against it is actually to do the exact opposite. Take your fence down, go outside, meet your neighbor. When the pandemic comes, don't make sure you have enough food for you, make sure you have enough food to share. Remind people that you're willing to share it with them. And I mean food in a really broad sense here. What my people knew, what Southern formerly enslaved people knew about what the disaster was that they were prepping for was collective and collaborative action when they had very little, and that each time they had very little, when they put it together with other people, they had a lot more. So I'm just going to encourage you, prep for the next disaster right now, because it's already happening, and prep for it not by getting enough for yourself, but by taking the little bit that you have and collaboratively working with the people around you who also have a little bit to make more.
I love you so much. That is an excellent way to end this conversation. Thank you, Scot Nakagawa. Thank you, Melissa Harris Perry, and thank all of you for joining us. You can find this on our Facebook page, and we're going to put it up somewhere too, because we recorded it, because obviously we have to remember this moment forever and take it with us. This is one tool in our toolbox to build Black political power and unrig the rules that have been rigged against our communities for so long. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you for all your work, Alicia. Thank you for all your work, Scott. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, you. Peace out, y'all.